Hello and welcome to the Commonweal Policy Podcast. I'm Craig Dalzell. I'm the head of policy at Commonweal, and today I'm joined by a very special guest. I'm joined by John Young from the Dovesdale Action Group, a campaign group that's actually quite local to me, fighting against the plans for a new incinerator that has been proposed for the area. Welcome, John. How are you?
Hi, fine, Craig. Thanks for having me along.
So this, as we're going to go through this conversation, while this is politics that is literally on my doorstep, this is something that's going to be affecting the local area quite dramatically. This is going to be a much wider national campaign as well, and we're going to go into that as we go through the conversation. But John, can you just tell me a little bit about the history of the Dovesdale Action Group, how it started, and how you got involved with it?
Sure, Craig. It was back in 2010. There was an application for another incinerator adjacent to the current proposal, which was known as Dovesdale Farm, and that was by a company called ScotGen, who proposed putting an incinerator there. As a community, to be honest, at that time we didn't know much about incineration and what the issues were surrounding that, but we certainly knew that this was something that was going to have a major impact, certainly on the landscape initially, and certainly visually as well. So our initial concern was from a community point of view, that what is this coming to our community and what is the impact on the kind of landscape. However, it very quickly transpired when we actually found out the detail of what this actually meant to us, not just in terms of the landscape and the visual intrusion, but the actual consequences of incineration and what that meant in the wider context of a number of areas. We then soon became supporters actually of a wider campaign actually against incineration in itself, due to the impact it's had. So there was community meetings had at the time, 2011, and without getting into too much of the detail, we actually found ourselves in a situation where before too long the campaign spread. We got a lot of national coverage as well as local coverage, and we actually collated over 20,000 individual letters. That's not a petition, that's individual letters of objection to this proposal, which at the time was the largest objection to any planning application in the whole of Scotland. And when you consider communities like Stonehouse only had 5,000 people, Kirkby Hill, Blackwood maybe another 3,500, that was quite an incredible statement from the community as to their position on incineration. So that's where it got to in terms of the plan application. The plan application, unfortunately, was passed by the then Council South Lanarkshire narrowly, and consent was given. However, that wasn't the end of it. From the campaign point of view, we decided that this was such an important issue that we start to raise the profile of it both nationally, and secondly we'd also start to then pursue ScotGen, who then had another incinerator down in Dumfries at the time, and we started highlighting the breaches of its PPC licence, that's its licence to operate, and lo and behold the place went on fire eventually and was closed down. So very appropriate, you could say, with incineration, but it did highlight a problem within incineration, that it is a dangerous industry and these fires are not that uncommon. So that was the kind of the background to where we were 10 years ago. ScotGen went out of business, the application did not proceed at that time. Lo and behold, 10 years later, we're back here again with another application, now for the largest incinerator in Scotland by Veidors. However, I would say that in between those years, we continued to fight with other applications in Scotland, and were helpful in supporting other groups in Hamilton who fought off an application there. It has not proceeded, and also we supported a campaign at Carnbrough over North Lanarkshire as well, and we also supported other campaigns in Scotland too, because we realise that as a local campaign group, it's not just about the local impact, it's about the national impact. And if we're going to address the issues of incineration, that we need to do that at a national level. So that's the background to where we are today.
Yeah, I have to say, it's somewhat of an irony given my position in politics today, but pretty much prior to 2012, I can say I didn't really have much of an interest in politics. But I do remember that first campaign back in 2010 and 2011, and I especially remember in the run-up to the 2011 Scottish elections when we had at least one councillor who was campaigning to become an MSP at that time. And I do remember him coming to my door. I won't name him, I won't name the party, but coming to my door saying that he was fully against this incinerator and would campaign against it in the Parliament. And I had to point out to him that I did recall that he had voted for it in the council. And I do remember the crestfallen look in his face when I pointed this out to him, and it was obvious that many people in the village had also pointed this out to him. So,
yeah, I think this is actually quite an important point, actually, because I think when we look at the issues that there are nationally, there are some issues which actually stretch beyond politics, and this is one of them when it comes to health and the environment, where it united a whole community regardless of their politics. And that was one of the things that we've continued to this point today. We've got a core group which is made up of all parties and none, but we've decided we're not going to support any party. However, we did state, and we did do it previously in 2010, decide that we would oppose those individuals who supported this application. In fact, so much so that at the following council elections, the councillor who was the chair of planning lost his seat, as did others. And we went to every polling station, regardless of our own views on the politics of it, and we campaigned outside those stations all day. We then continued that campaign to the parliamentary, I think it was 2011, if I remember rightly, and the then Finance Minister, Tom McCabe, actually stated himself that his loss in the campaign was down to the fact that there was a community campaign which had a backlash on his party at that time for passing the application. So equally so, there's candidates who were successful, who actually supported the campaign, as a consequence got themselves elected. So I think it was a warning right across, not just South Lanarkshire, but other councils as well, to say, look, when a community objects against something so strongly, they need to have a voice, and we felt our voice wasn't being heard. So it was a real wake-up call. And also it was alerted people to the wider issues, obviously the environmental side of it as well.
Yeah, there are very, very few things in politics more deleterious than a community expressing their view and then it being overruled, as that planning proposal was. So let's bring things up a decade later. We have this new plan. Where has that come from, and why has that arrived? You know, again, despite this history of objection from the local communities.
That's a very good question, Craig, and we're still trying to find out ourselves why this has come at this time. Forgetting, of course, or not forgetting, of course, that there's a worldwide pandemic on, that SEPA is under a cyber security attack. Veidors chosen to submit this proposal, which is at a consultation stage just now during this time. However, we've been aware for some years that Veidors has been working behind the scenes, looking towards getting an incinerator in a number of locations. Now, we're not aware of where those locations are, because it would tell us, but we do know that the site, which is at Dovesdale, was being considered. Transpires they are actually looking at a site at Overwood, which is the farm immediately next to it, in the heartland of Greenbelt, South Lanarkshire, between the villages of Stonehouse, Netherburn, Blackwood and Kipney Hill. So their reasons for this, I suppose they think that there'll be profit in this, but from a community activist point of view, we do not think it's appropriate that should be profiting from pollution. And we've asked for breakdowns of how much they think they will make from this venture. We've not received that, but clearly there is incentives there that they believe that financially it is rewarding to incinerate our waste instead of recycling it, and to the detriment of the climate change. So that's a question, I suppose, for Veidors in many ways, but that is something that we will continue to press them on.
Yeah, and I have to say, from the literature we have received from Veidors in the local area, they've been fairly coy about things like what is their projected CO2 footprint from this plant. I have been looking into some of the numbers around it. They from the amount of waste that they are projected to burn, for instance, you can do some rough back-of-the-envelope calculations and work out that if the plant was running at full capacity, you could be looking at a carbon footprint of something in the region of 500,000 tonnes per year, which is about the equivalent of the personal carbon footprints of roughly just a little bit under the population of Hamilton. Yeah. So it's not insignificant.
No, it's massive, and it's as I said before, it's the largest incinerator of its kind in Scotland. We take into considering what's happening across the rest of the UK, we've really got to question our governments as to, are they really committed to addressing climate change? I mean, we've got a situation where at 2000, for municipal waste just in England alone, when it was incinerated, I believe it was 9% of that waste was incinerated, and we're at a stage now where today I think it's at 45.5% of that municipal waste is actually going to incineration. That's not acceptable. And there's other issues too, where we find that there's now councils are having difficulties with renegotiating contracts and these long-term contracts that they've got with these incinerator companies, which are starting to cost some councils a fortune. And that was highlighted quite recently in Channel 4's Dispatches programme. It's called The Dirty Truth About Your Waste, if I remember rightly. And so this is something that's coming to the fore recently. It's not just about how this impacts in our communities, and I think that's where the community clearly will come forward and say this is how it's going to impact on me. But we need to get people into a kind of frame of mind where, how does it impact on all of us? Yeah. It's about all of us. It's about the environment. And if we're going to change national policy, we need to look at this in a more strategic way and actually unite our forces in trying to put pressure on to seek change here. Because at the moment, we have a national policy which is called a circular economy. But we would argue that circular economy in terms of the green industry should not include incineration. Incineration is not green, and the damage that is causing is got consequences far down the line. So we are looking for those governments across the UK, not just in Scotland, because we're part of a wider movement now, to say that, look, we need a moratorium here. We need to establish what are the facts now than when we last kind of reviewed it, because things are changing significantly, and none more or less than in climate change. Yeah,
and that point about the circular economy is really worth hammering in here. The circular economy is something that we've talked about on the previous episodes of the Policy Podcast. Just for listeners who might not have heard those episodes, we see things like even recycling as a symptom of failure in a way. What we want to get to is an ideal where resources that are brought into the economy are as much as possible reused and repaired and kept going round in circles for as long as possible. But when they finally do break down to the point where something can't be repaired anymore, then as much as possible of that, those materials really should be compostable. We shouldn't be sending things to landfill. We shouldn't be sending things to incinerators, and only those things that are, returned to the soil should be allowed to leave the circular economy. Everything else should be reused, repaired, remanufactured, and then sort of recycled. You're right. Nothing should be going to landfill, and nothing should be going to incinerators. That's not a circular economy. That's the end of the cycle.
Yeah, it needs a fundamental change in a review to address this, because my concern is that within the industry, it's producing packaging, etc., that they're saying the right things quite often, but they're not necessarily doing the right things. And unless that changes dramatically soon, we need to influence government to ensure that brings in legislation to make these things happen, and that there are small signs that is happening now, even as recently as in terms of incineration. Only I think it's 3 weeks ago now, Welsh Assembly announced a moratorium on large-scale incinerators in Wales, with the proposed introduction of an incineration tax as a disincentive to actually send stuff to incineration in the first place. But it's a sea change it's needed here, and we need to be part of that change to influence our governments to go down that route. But I think there's a feeling that I think we can see that in some of the politics we have today, and in a lot of the media that we see today, that there's a willingness to do it. But at the end of the day, we need action to implement this now.
Yeah, and this is even perhaps when we can start talking to folk who might be investing in companies who want to start building these things, because we have to start thinking, what is the business case for an incinerator when the world does move to this circular economy and we aren't producing packaging that needs to go and be incinerated or sent to landfill. I mean, we're already seeing in countries like Sweden where the incinerators there are having to import waste because domestic recycling rates are so high, they just don't have enough to burn in them.
Yeah, that's correct. And it's also the case, I believe, in Denmark as well, where they're having to import the waste just to keep these incinerators going. And that's a worrying trend if that's allowed to continue, and allowed to continue here as well. I mean, we should be seeing waste as a resource, not a problem. And there's profit to be had in that potentially too. But again, for those companies involved, we seem to be going down this path of incineration, and hiding the waste by burning it. But the consequences of doing that, I don't think, when we looked at that circular economy back in the early days, I don't think they actually foresaw the impact that is having on climate change today. So it's urgent we get those who've got shared interests here round the table to review this as soon as possible.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost one of those strange paradoxes or perverse incentives that have come out of policy where, yes, sending waste to landfill is pretty bad and should be avoided at all costs, but the rise of incineration has come out of that, because if you're not sending waste to landfill, what do you do with it? The instant answer is, well, burn it. And that, as you say, hides the problem, just pumps the problem into the atmosphere. And we're now in this situation where, yes, sending something like plastic to a landfill and burying it underground is far from ideal, but on a global scale, maybe the CO2 produced by burning that plastic is even worse. Of course, the ideal solution is to not produce that plastic at all in the first place, which gets us back to that circular economy idea of we need that political push to reduce this waste at source, so that the goods that produced waste are just not made in that way, are redesigned so that packaging just doesn't exist.
Yeah, and I think there's opportunities there as well. I mean, I think we've got to look at this in terms of what are the jobs that could be created through changing that industry in terms of the packaging? What are the jobs that could be created through recycling as opposed to incineration? And obviously the consequences to the environment in relation to that. So we need to get these companies to see that they need to look at a B plan. At the moment, there is only one plan, and that's incinerate, and we're not seeing the changes that we hoped that there would be in terms of the recycling. But I would hope that the Scottish Government, whoever they are, after the election, decide that, you know, there's an opportunity here, and let's see if Scotland actually can be a leader in this respect and actually encourage others to follow, rather than us trying to play catch up maybe with the likes of Wales, who in relative terms are actually doing better than us in terms of recycling figures. So there is opportunities here as well. It's not just about getting at the incineration industry. There is a place for these companies, but not within the position they're at the moment of incinerating our waste.
Yeah, so where do we go from here? I mean, this started out as a local campaign, and as you said, it's already, so even the previous campaign over the Dovesdale incinerator rapidly went national. So what are your next steps for this phase of the campaign?
They are twofold. Certainly at a local level, we are awaiting the formal application from Veidors to submit a planning application. And we will be looking at, again, even within the constraints that we have during the pandemic, to submit thousands, if not tens of thousands, again, of objections to this proposal. We will also be trying to follow what's happening at a national level in terms of bringing together like-minded folks like ourselves and groups who have got a common interest in seeking a moratorium. Now, we are already working behind the scenes in that regard and speaking to all the parties. And it was good to see even today the Green Party actually have made some announcements in that regard as well.
Yeah.
They're actually saying they're going to replace, they're hoping to replace landfill tax with a local waste disposal tax as a disincentive to incineration. And they're also opposed, as they say, to the construction of new incinerators as well. And we've also got a major step forward when, for the first time, Christina McKelvey, who's MSP, coincidentally for this area, has actually formally called for a moratorium in Scotland on incineration. But equally, we are also speaking to Labour Party, we've spoke to Conservatives as well, and we think there's actually the possibility here of forming a cross-party consensus on this to review the situation as it is at the moment. And we will be pushing for that. In fact, we're pushing for it right now as we speak. But we'll certainly be pushing the button on that to a great extent once the elections are over, as it's too important. And as I said before, it crosses the political kind of boundaries that we all have as well.
Yeah, it certainly reminds me of the fracking campaign of 5 years ago, where we had this mass upswell of public anger against the policy and public support for the campaign against it, and that as well, hit records in terms of the number of people who were submitting to the public consultations and getting involved in the campaigns. So how can people get involved in this campaign in particular, whether they're local to this area where the incinerator is, or whether they want to get involved in the broader national campaign?
Yeah, well, at the moment, it's early days in terms of formulating the national campaign. We're doing that as we currently speak. In fact, I was actually involved in the anti-fracking movement as well, leading the South Lanarkshire group here, and saw the benefits of uniting groups like that across the country. But in terms of local context, we've established a Facebook page, which is just called Dovesdale Action Group, and that has already got about 2,000 new members just over the last couple of months alone in regards to that. We're also establishing a web page as well, which has currently been set up too. But we're also linking into other groups too, and trying to share information, share knowledge and understanding of what's happening at a local, national level, and also trying to unite the village and villages across the South Lanarkshire to see that, this is something bigger than all of us, that at the end of the day, we don't exist if we don't have the air to breathe, and this is something which I think does capture imagination. And I think the likes of Greta Thunberg and all the young activists that have come to the fore in recent years have actually re-engaged a community which before wasn't really interested in what was happening behind the scenes. As long as the waste was getting dealt with, they turned a blind eye to it. But I think we can all now see the consequences of climate change on our doorsteps, and for some people that's literally on their doorsteps. So something has to change, and from a community context, I think that's where we see ourselves over the coming weeks and months.
Yeah, I mean, it's often said that all politics is local, and it is things like this that really bring it home to folk. Literally. Yeah,
that's right.
So, well, John, thank you for coming on to the podcast. I will put a link in the description of the podcast to send people to the Facebook group. And as we come to the end of the podcast, I'd just like to remind all of our listeners that Commonweal is entirely supported by folk like yourselves. So if you like the podcast and you like our policy work and our broader campaigns, there is a donate button in the description below the podcast. Next week, I hope to be rejoined by my co-conspirator, Jonathan Shaffey, where we'll be bringing you more from the political world of Scotland as we run up to the elections. So I hope you will join us next week.